Welcome back. Are there prominent Black figures in Islamic history? In our segment today, we'll have an in-depth discussion about Black Muslims and the idea of Blackness through a historical Islamic lens. To have this engaging discussion, we have with us Imam Dawood Walid, co-author of Centering Black Narrative, Black Muslim Nobles Among the Early Pious Muslims. He is also the executive director of the Michigan's chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations and a member of the Michigan Muslim Community Council Imams Committee. Welcome to the show, Imam Dawood.
Thank you very much.
So, in your book, Centering Black Narratives, you talk a lot about the impact Black Muslims have had in Islamic history to where we are today. So why is it that you think Muslims specifically are finding ourselves in a place where Black people are being marginalized within our communities? How did we get here?
Well, I think there's three things. The first thing is that many people are ignorant about the early Islamic history and even try to make some distinction about Arabness and Blackness being a mutually exclusive identity. So for instance, we highlight in our book that Bani Sulaim, which was a prominent tribe in Arabia at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, that was a Black Arab tribe. And in the days of ignorance preceding the revealing of the Quran, they would recite poetry bragging about their Blackness, because at that time, tribal affiliation was a source of glory and pride for the Arabs. So many people are just really ignorant about this history and the social context of the Arabs in Medina in particular.
And it sounds like the color of the skin wasn't a thing, right? It was more, like you mentioned, it's more about the tribal connection.
Exactly. It wasn't an issue about discriminating against someone based upon skin color per se. It was more of the tribalistic society where people would take pride or fight against other people based upon tribal affiliation. It was not related directly to skin color or to hair texture, because many of the Arabs' hair was described as being jad or being kinky, like most people of African descent or from the West Indies, right? This is one point. The second point is during the rule of the Abbasid dynasty, those rulers began to favor marrying lighter-skinned women from Persia and from Europe, or having children, siring children by lighter-skinned women, and this set up a type of classist system where the people who were the rulers or the people who held the positional power were lighter skinned, and then it began to be an issue of class based upon skin color.
Okay.
This is a second issue that affected Muslims. We're talking about 1,200 years ago that this started. It's not a new phenomenon. But what I also think has added on to the issue of anti-Blackness in our community is that we cannot underestimate the influence that colonialism had on Muslims and Muslim lands. When the British, when the French went into Muslim lands, colonized them, this bred a type of implicit anti-Blackness and inferiority complexes to their own cultures, and then centering whiteness or white normalcy is not only being more educated, more civilized, but even being more beautiful. And proof of this is that skin bleach cream in South Asia, in Arab countries in Africa, such as Fair and Lovely, we're talking about this is a multi-billion-dollar industry of where companies owned by Europeans are selling skin bleach cream in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh.
I've seen ads even now.
Egypt to Senegal, right? And there's an impact of how standards of beauty have been influenced and has been made hyper through the issue of colonialization. So when even the name Fair and Lovely, like I don't even like using that term fair, because then would that make my skin color unfair? Like fairness is, like the word fair is connected with like being something good, right? So we have a lot to work through, but there's a number of influences of why we have not just colorism, but anti-Blackness that exists within the Muslim community that needs to be dealt with.
So would it be also important to start thinking about this from cultural practices, and that was a culture at the time, so it's not like the religion was advocating for this?
Well, definitely. If you look at religious texts, the Quran is actually the only religious text you can find that actually gives incentives and talks about the merits of freeing slaves. The Prophet Muhammad, prayers and peace be upon him, at the time of his death, all the people that he had that had come in contact with who were slaves that came underneath his custodianship, those people had been freed, had been liberated. So he didn't own any slaves at the time of his passing. Umar bin al-Khattab, he freed so many slaves when he was the caliph, the second caliph of Islam, and it is estimated that Ali ibn Abi Talib, who was the fourth caliph, it's estimated that he freed personally up to 1,000 people from slavery. So it wasn't seen by those early Muslims, those saintly type of people, that there was any merit in owning slaves. To the contrary, they were abolitionists.
So in your book, just going on, building from this, you talk about, you quote Dr. Sherman Jackson when he's comparing white supremacy to idolism, and I think that's very relevant to this conversation in our times today. So explain to me how he was doing that and what point you were trying to make with that.
Well, Dr. Sherman Abdul Hakim Jackson, which is an Islamic scholar, teaches at the University of Southern California, he said that white supremacy is the modern day idolatry, right? So you have this situation of where Europe came and basically colonialized most of the darker world, then began to not only impose its way of life or white normalcy, but actually in its imposing this white normalcy, that in order to be civilized, in order to be refined, that other people need to copy their systems of government, their cultural habits, right? But what Dr. Jackson's also saying, or we can take from this, is that there's a sense of arrogance that is involved in this. Is a sense of entitlement that when we look at the Quran, we can actually see two figures where this white supremacy, or the idea of white supremacy, plays itself out not only as idolatrous, but we can also say satanic, right? So from the satanic perspective, when Iblis, which I believe Christians refer to as Lucifer, when he was in the garden, and God, according to the Quran, commanded all of those in the company of the angels were to prostrate to Adam. All of them did except for Iblis. And his statement was, I am better than him. You made me of fire, but you made him of clay. So he thought there was something that was intrinsic in his very being that made him superior. And this is really what the idea of white supremacy is, right? Yeah. That there is an intrinsic greater worth or value. And this has been propagated all throughout the world, not just overtly, but even subtly. Now, the second point is we're talking about idolatrous, or perhaps the worst idolatrous mentioned in the Quran was Pharaoh. Because Pharaoh said in the Quran, I am your Lord, the Most High. So he perceived himself, he took himself as a god, and he perceived himself to be the very reason for the existence of creation, and he imposed that not only upon his own people, but also on the children of Israel. So when we talk about the imposing of white normalcy, when we talk about the issue of global, the idea of global white supremacy, how it plays itself out economically, how it plays itself out regarding culture, how it plays itself out of trying to impose ways of life and political systems upon other people, then this is where we can see that it's a type of modern day idolatry.
So how does all of this, thinking about white supremacy, thinking about racism within our communities, what are some of the, bringing this back to our faith, what are some of the spiritual consequences to racism that as Muslims will experience?
Well, racism is a disease of the heart first. It's a spiritual malady, we can say. It's something inside the person's heart. So in order to fix the issue, there has to be spiritual remedies first. It just can't be something intellectual. But for the person, there are two victims, this spiritual malady. There is first the one who is the object of the racism. Okay. And then there is the perpetrator of racism that's doing harm to their own soul, right, by performing the racism. So the object of the racism, they not only can be marginalized from the community or marginalized in society, not having equal access to economic opportunities, education, marriage, but this type of racism can also instill inferiority complexes, so what's called internalized oppression, where the object of the racism can then begin to believe what is being said about them or how they're treated and think that this is what they deserve, and look at the racists as actually being better than them in some ways. This is a problem. The other, for the racists themselves, it can cause them to have arrogance. Arrogance is a major sin, and they can take on the attributes of Pharaoh and Iblis, two accursed beings that are mentioned in the Quran.
So I was actually watching a show, and there were mild undertone references to racism, and the characters in the movie are trying to explain to a child, and they're saying, look, these are just, racism doesn't have to be so overt and you're completely putting people down, but can be undertones where it's subtly mean about things. So how do you, for a lot of people, they might be hearing this conversation and they may say, okay, yeah, maybe I have some feelings very subtle, and I don't think I'll go to the point where I'm arrogant or I'll become like Pharaoh. How do you address, what are some practical steps that people can take who feel like, yeah, maybe, I do have one or two racist tendencies that I'm conscious or not conscious about, and now I'm starting to address it?
Well, none of us as human beings are infallible, and we all should be about the process of spiritual purification. Also in society, we all can take on implicit bias because we live in societies, we are informed by certain imageries, certain things that we read, and we can be involved in racism if not actively, passively involved in it. So what is very important for us as Muslims in particular, but all people, is to be involved in the process of contemplation as well as taking self-inventory. It's called muhasaba in the Arabic language, where we sit back and we look at not only our actions, but what thoughts or feelings that creep into our hearts. What comes into our minds? When we look at someone, do we automatically think someone is lesser than us? Or we just intrinsically or have reflex actions that we think someone is potentially more criminal or less educated just because of their physical appearance? When we get these types of thoughts that creep into our inside, we need to check ourselves and say, where does this come from, right? Why are we thinking this way? And then perhaps we need to go and try to interact more with those people that we have these problematic thoughts or ideas about. And that's part of the cure. One of the Islamic scholars of Islamic spirituality, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, he says that when we have feelings of arrogance, where we think that people are lower than us, then our first reflex should be, or we should say to ourselves the opposite of what Iblis said. Iblis said, I'm better than him. Al-Ghazali said, no, he or she's better than me. Meaning there's probably something in that person I don't know, where they have a virtue, a fadl, or a merit that I don't have, and I should seek out and see what is that virtue, what is that piece of knowledge, what is something about their behavior, their etiquettes that they have that I don't have that maybe I need to implement.
Thank you so much, Imam Dawood. I think you really brought this conversation back to sort of the self and really helping people think about it. I know I have some thoughts going in my head right now. So thank you so much, Imam Dawood.
Thank you very much.
If you want more of Let the Quran Speak, you can watch previous episodes or new ones by subscribing to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/QuranSpeaks. Stay updated by liking us on Facebook and following us on Twitter @Quran_speaks. And when you're on the go, listen to our podcast at QuranSpeaks.com.